This week on the agenda, we saw a premier prepare to hand over the reins, a precedent for the world, closing the education gap for Ontario's Aboriginals, and a new urban landscape for Canada's largest city. Our week in review begins with former Ontario Liberal Party President Tim Murphy on Premier McGuinty's sudden resignation.
Did this catch you by surprise?
A little bit. I think the timing did. I mean, what's interesting is some of the people who were close to him, obviously Greg is one of them, were, some of them had left to move on to other things, including people like Greg, in fact. But, what I heard, and from the people I talked to, was that he had, in his mind, the possibility he would go and advance in the next election. It was on his mind in a way it hadn't been before any other election. And that he felt a responsibility to allow an opportunity for a new leader to come in and do that. And what I think his initial time frame was longer, frankly. And as the reality of the minority parliament, as Greg said, descended, and in particular the likelihood that the government in the current incarnation could not survive the next budget, he looked out there. He kind of had to make the decision now as to whether to stay or go. And I think having faced that, he said, look, I got to go, and the responsible time to go is now, to give a party time to elect a new leader, and the new leader time to put together a budget, a throne speech, and face the legislature.
John, catch you off guard?
Yeah, sure, a little bit. But I agree with Tim that you could sort of sense, and with Maria and with Greg, you could sort of sense the decision starting to have to be made. The timeline of the life of the government being foreshortened by the descent of the parliament into unworkability. And then there's a human factor. Thanksgiving is a funny time. And these things sort of tend to happen around periods of family reflection.
It's happened 3 times lately, hasn't it?
Yeah, I remember Bill Davis and Thanksgiving back in
Mike Harris on
1984.
Thanksgiving.
Mike Harris on Thanksgiving. So there may be a sort of walk among the cranberries that these guys take this time of year, or among the leaves. But it's a time for reflection, and we can't ignore the human element, because when your pathway and your party's pathway to do the things that you're there to do is blocked, you can either call an election, or if you're not sure you want to lead on that, you start thinking about your family, and there you are at the table, and suddenly it all gets very clear, and you say the things that he said, I thought, with great dignity and appropriateness.
Was Dalton McGuinty a good premier?
That's straight out, eh? Well, I'm going to say no. I'm going to be generous here. I mean, here's where he was successful. He won 3 elections. To his credit, anybody in politics should admire success. I think that is the winningest Liberal since Oliver Mowat.
126 years.
There you go, back at the end of the 19th century. But I think he is now leaving a province in decline, deeply in debt, shedding private sector jobs, and in a cloud of scandal. My answer to the question is no. He won elections, but I think he left the province worse off than when he found it.
What do you think proroguing the legislature, as he has done, will do to his legacy?
I'd worry about that if I were him. I just don't think he would want to leave as one of his last major decisions as premier. That he basically walked away from the job and then, if you will, turned off the lights in the legislature. I mean, we're at a crucial tipping point in this province. Our economy is in trouble. We're in a debt crisis. We're spending $1.8 million more every hour than we take in revenue. We've got this ongoing issue with the gas plants and others. I don't know if Dalton McGuinty truly wants to make part of his legacy that when the going got tough, not only did he walk away, but he basically closed down our ability to get things done to resolve the problems he's left behind.
Why do you think he did it then?
I think that he took the decision seriously to leave. That's not one that you take lightly. I had a conversation with Terry. I will say that, I sit across from the house there every day, back and forth. I think the fire in the belly had been extinguished. I just didn't see it there.
That's a bit harsh.
Well, is that too harsh?
Extinguished?
Okay, had petered out somewhat. I'll be a bit more generous. I just didn't see the fire there, and the legislative agenda was pretty mild. So it didn't surprise me that he was considering leaving. I would not have guessed middle of October. I thought maybe Christmas time. It did surprise me, though, that you would prorogue the legislature, take all the bills and committee hearings and basically kick them down the road or end them. And I think that what this reflects is a premier who's more worried about his reputation and that of the Liberal Party than the interests of taxpayers who expect us to work on creating jobs and balancing the books. So he clearly put the future of the Liberal Party, their interests, ahead of what he should have done, and that's the interest of the province as a whole.
Do you think Dalton McGuinty's been a good premier for Ontario?
You know, I think Dalton McGuinty's done what he thought was the right thing for Ontario. Many, many things I disagreed with, although you'll know that there are things that I supported in terms of some of his initiatives. At the bottom line, or the end of the day, the thing you remember is that that he worked hard, that he was dedicated, he was passionate, and that he he dedicated a lot of time and a lot of commitment, and that's something I think everybody needs to respect.
He has prorogued the legislature. What do you think that will do to his legacy as people consider that?
Well, I think that's the most unfortunate story coming out of last night's announcement, is that he went out in a bit of a cloud with the prorogation. I don't believe there was a necessity to prorogue the House. I think that they were certainly setting up a scenario whereby they could justify a prorogation. But look, at a lot of the stalling of things in the legislature was directly because the government chose not to put committees together, and they chose not to be quick off the mark to get the committee that was supposed to look at the gas plants put in place. And so you can't, on the one hand, say we can't get anything done in the House, and on the other hand, be the people that are actually manufacturing that blockage.
Well, let me put his explanation to you, and then you tell me what you think about it. He says by proroguing, we can have a bit of a pause, hotheads can cool down. There's the potential of coming to negotiated agreements with the teacher unions, for example. There's the possibility of coming to an agreement, probably not with you, but with Tim Hudak and the Conservatives on the wage freeze bill. None of that's going to happen if the temperature rising of question period happens every day. So we prorogue and give a chance for cooler heads to prevail. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, I think that's the government's spin on avoiding the gas plant scandal. I mean, let's face it, you don't have to prorogue the House to have a leadership race. Many leadership races have taken place without a prorogation. And in fact, you don't have to prorogue the House to have the conversation with the public sector unions. I've been encouraging the Premier to have that conversation for months and months and months now. So neither one of those things are justifiable. What's really happening here is the government wants to put a lid on the Oakville plant particularly. He doesn't want that issue to go to committee. He doesn't want his political colleagues and his party colleagues to be called before that committee to testify, and that's what this is all about, avoiding that.
We are going to spend a little bit of time off the top here just talking about what went down yesterday, because it has changed things for the Premier, for the province, for you, potentially for everybody. How surprised were you?
Very. I think everyone was surprised. We've had a very solid team, and I don't think anybody saw it coming.
You had no heads up on this at all?
We were all very surprised, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room when we were listening to the Premier.
And when he said at that sort of midway point of his speech, "Are you all ready for this?"
Did you hear people say no?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah. You knew it was coming then.
Well, yeah, because we had seen. Terry, his wife, was in the room, and
when you saw her, you knew something was up.
When we saw Terry come into the caucus room, we thought, yeah. So I think everyone is very surprised and very moved by his decision.
Having said that, do you think he has tarnished somewhat his legacy in the way he's going out, insofar as he's prorogued the legislature at the same time, his critics would argue, in order to avoid this whole contempt thing with your colleague Chris Bentley, the energy minister?
You know, really, Steve, part of the surprise is that we're all kind of reeling and I think focusing on all of the good work that we've done, the good work that he's done. He's been a remarkable leader, underestimated at every turn, I think, and he has so over-delivered in terms of his accomplishments in the province, whether it's education or healthcare, energy, right across the board.
Winning elections.
Winning elections, exactly. So that's really what I've been thinking about for the last 24 hours, is what he's done for the province.
And you haven't heard it from people about proroguing?
A little bit. I think there are a lot of people who really don't know what proroguing means. I think that it makes sense to people that there needs to be a sort of step back and figure out what the future of the party is. And the pundits and the historians will weigh in on the prorogation.
They haven't waited. They already are. Well, you talked about the future of the party, and of course some people are going to wonder whether that means you. Have you thought about running for the leadership?
So way too early to have that conversation in terms of
Not
commitment.
too early to tell me whether you've thought about it.
Well, I think that I think there are lots of us who have thought about it. What I am thinking about right now is how do we have the best and most complete debate on the future of the province? What are the voices that need to be there? What are the points of view that need to be there? And how do we make sure that there's a full range? Because I think that will do the party and the province the best service.
And what does that argue for?
Well, it argues for paying close attention to who decides to go in. It argues for me and my colleagues having conversations with our political friends and people who have been supporters, and making the determination based on that interaction. But that takes a little bit of time, and because we were surprised yesterday, we're those of us who are having those conversations need a bit of time.
Okay, you and I could
No
go on
commitment.
we go on for half an hour doing this, but we made a commitment to you. We're going to talk Aboriginal issues and made that same commitment to our viewers. So we'll leave yesterday's news alone now, and let's move on. You've been all over the place, looking into Aboriginal affairs, looking into education on reserves. Give us a few bullet points here. What have you learned?
Well, I've learned that geography has a huge role to play in what we can and can't do, and in the success of kids on reserve in the province. We've got 45,000 Aboriginal students in our provincial schools, so there are about 12,000 students who are in reserve schools. There are 133 reserves or 133 First Nations in the province. But when we talk about Aboriginal students, Steve, we're talking about First Nations, Métis, and Inuit students. So there's a mix of kids that we're talking about. And the main thing that I've learned is that there is a large and persistent gap between the achievement of kids on reserve and Aboriginal kids and the rest of the population.
For sure. Federal government, provincial government, Aboriginal leadership itself, are you concerned that if you try to, in all good efforts, contribute something here, you're just adding another layer of bureaucracy to what's already an overly bureaucratic mess?
Well, what I want to see is that we come up with the right support. So if that means a governance model that includes an Aboriginal or a First Nations education authority, then we need to do that. And you will know, Steve, that right now the federal government is talking about an Education Act that I think would bring in a sort of framework. I haven't seen the legislation, but would bring in a framework that potentially could create some opportunity for First Nations to develop education authorities and then get support from the federal government. We don't know exactly how that will work, but we believe that as a provincial government, we have a responsibility in working with the First Nations and the federal government to make that happen. Because this is about outcomes for these kids. And these are complicated lives that kids on reserve are leading. They're complicated lives that Aboriginal kids are leading.
On August 31st, 2009, Darcy Allen Shepherd died after an incident involving former Attorney General Michael Bryant. Shepherd was a well-known cyclist. Bryant was in his car. Earlier this month, we spoke with Bryant, and now in the interests of equal time, Shepherd's father is with us to tell us more about his son. You know, of course, about the circumstances around his death, or you know some of the circumstances around his death. You also know, as you pointed out, that the special Crown Attorney brought in from out of province in order to look into this looked at what he had to look at and decided not to go ahead with a trial and to drop all the charges against Michael Bryant. And I'm wondering whether you think justice was done in this case.
Well, the charges should have been dropped. I don't have any problem with that. The likelihood of getting a conviction was remote, given my son's background. And let me say, I have no problem with the notion that one is innocent unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm aware of too many cases in Canada and other places where people have been convicted and even executed because that basic principle was ignored. But having accepted that conclusion, somewhat reluctly, because I felt that it was inappropriate for Mr. Peck to have made it. I would rather a judge have made it. I accept that a kind of justice was done, at least to Mr. Bryant. Where I believe justice was not done to my son, and where I believe justice was not done to society as a whole, is in the decision that Mr. Peck and his team made to accept as objective and credible the testimony of Mr. Bryant and his wife in an interview given under without prejudice circumstances, which means that they told their story not under oath, not under cross-examination, with the clear understanding that anything they said would not be used against them in court, with their lawyer present to filter any of the questions that were asked. And to accept testimony given on that basis as objective from people who were involved and clearly could not have been objective, and credible from people who were not subject to oath and were not subject to cross-examination seems to me a distortion of what justice is all about.
You're going to forgive the bluntness of this next question, but we had Michael Bryant in this studio a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him similar questions. So in the interest of fairness, Mr. Shepherd, I'm going to ask you too.
Yeah.
Do you think Michael Bryant got away with murder?
No.
Okay. Michael Bryant was also asked by me last time he was here that no matter what really happened that night, there are some people who are going to think he got away with murder. And I'm now going to ask you the flip side of that question, which is, no matter what happened that night, there are some people who are going to believe that your son terrorized Michael Bryant into panicking, and that resulted in the death of your son. How much truth do you think there is in that?
I think that after Mr. Bryant ran my son down, and that's the term I use, Mr. Peck and Mr. Bryant minimized what happened, but my son was parked on his bike at least 2 bike lengths in front of the car, facing forward all the time that Mr. Bryant claims he was being terrorized by things my son was saying and doing. During that time, the car lurched forward 3 times. On the 3rd time, my son fell onto the hood of the car, was carried forward for 30 feet with his bicycle underneath the bumper, being dragged and probably wrecked from his point of view. Then when Mr. Bryant stopped the car suddenly, my son was thrown off. Mr. Peck would have it that he fell off, but if you consider momentum in that situation at all, he was thrown forward onto the street. At which point, I think, quite appropriately, he was angry. Mr. Peck, again in his statement to the court, says at that point, but Mr. Shepherd was not seriously injured at that time because he got up within 2 seconds. I'm not sure how he's qualified to make that statement. He's neither medically or first responder trained. But having said that, of course my son would have been angry. When he got up, though, what he is quoted as saying to me by the police, and I believe in Mr. Bryant's book, I haven't got that far into it, my son said to the people who were around, "You're my witnesses, you're my witnesses." Is that the kind of thing that someone would say to someone he intended to attack? I'm not saying Mr. Bryant wasn't afraid at that point. I'm sure that my son looked when he got up from the pavement after what had happened like the Incredible Hulk. But that doesn't mean that he was the kind of mad, out of control, vengeful person that Mr. Bryant paints him.
Okay, but
Mr.
again,
Bryant could have been afraid.
to the overarching issue here, that because of your son's criminal past, because of his addictions in his past, because of the antisocial behavior that he occasionally demonstrated in the past, there will be those who say he was the architect of his own demise on that night. Is that a fair comment?
Well, no, it's not, because I can understand, and Mr. Bryant and Mr. Peck, sadly, painted that kind of picture, but life is not black and white. This is not a good or evil situation where my son is the manifestation of total evil and Mr. Bryant is the manifestation of total good. My son had evil elements and good elements in him, and they were present in him at the time of the incident, and Mr. Bryant had the same thing.
I want to start by reading an excerpt of Peter Beinert's from the Daily Beast from earlier this summer, where he writes, by conventional benchmarks, Barack Obama's Middle East policy has been quite successful. He's killed Osama bin Laden and many other top al-Qaeda leaders. With Europe's help, he's imposed crushing sanctions on Iran. He's successfully withdrawn troops from Iraq. According to polls, foreign policy is among his greatest political strengths. Let's start here. We're going to go through the various files, if you like, that are on the president's desk and talk about whether he or Mitt Romney would be better for the world. And so, Jeffrey, get us started. How is Obama regarded in the Arab world after almost 4 years in power?
A bit of ambivalence. On the one hand, he started his presidency with, you'll remember, a speech in Cairo where he promised to kind of remake relations with the Muslim world. And then, of course, he went to Istanbul and gave a speech before the Turkey's parliament where he basically promised the same thing again. But then the real test came when the Arab Street kind of exploded in the Arab awakening with the overthrow of Mubarak.
Did he pass the test?
Well, it was ambivalence because at first they sided with the regime and very slowly backed away from the regime and finally said Mubarak's got to go. And so the Arab Street is still rather distrustful. Then in Libya, right, after having a period of great restraint in Egypt, right, in Libya they sided with the opposition, right, and helped overthrow Gaddafi. Now comes Syria, right? And they're playing a very careful and tricky game with Istanbul's help, siding with the kind of people who would overthrow Assad without actually bringing to power a regime which could be a lot worse. And so they're in a position now, I think, of great ambivalence in the Arab world. Are they going to appeal to the Arab Street, the things that the Arab Street might want, without overthrowing the traditional allies in the region of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and other non-democratic regimes in the Gulf states?
Malou Innocent, you're there in Washington, D.C. How do you think Barack Obama is regarded in the Arab world?
I would agree with the previous speaker. I think it has been largely ambivalence. There was also a great deal of expectation and excitement when he was running for office and when he was finally in the Oval Office. But I think the negatives are against him in many respects. In one respect, although he did withdraw U.S. troops from Iraq as he promised and as Americans wanted, he's also tripled the number of troops in Afghanistan. He's increased and expanded the number of drone strikes in neighboring Pakistan. He's expanded them beyond the traditional battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan into Yemen and Somalia. And so this has really been an irritant in the Arab world and in the broader Muslim world. And as we've seen recently with the attacks on the U.S. embassies and consulates in 25 various Muslim states, there's a palpable anger, not just with Obama, but also with broader U.S. policies. And these were these were events that were triggered also by a video, of course, but also by a militant Islamic extremism that's also been sort of whipped up with the increased militarization of U.S. policy. And I think on this point, what sort of troubles me most about President Obama's foreign policy is that he's really embraced many of the most hawkish aspects of the Bush administration's policies, and yet at the same time he's condemned as being weak and bumbling by many Republicans within Washington. So this almost serves to shift the foreign policy goalpost in Washington further to the right and in a way that actually becomes detrimental to America's long-term interests.
Let me get Paul Heinbecker's view on that. Do you think he has retained some of the most muscular, if you like, policies from the Bush years?
Well, he clearly has, insofar as getting rid of bin Laden is the one thing he's done. The drone attacks in Pakistan have decapitated a large part of al-Qaeda. He's taken a very tough line, a tougher line, I would say, on Pakistan. Same thing for Yemen. Same thing in the Red Sea area. He's a stronger president than I think he's given credit for, and we saw some clarity in the debate between Biden and Ryan. Biden made very clear that they were not going to go further, that they were out of Iraq, they were getting out of Afghanistan when they said they would get out of Afghanistan, and they were not going to be putting troops in Syria. It was a very clear-cut statement, and I think that from the point of view of the Arab Spring, we're beginning to see something else, and that is that the countries that used to not want the United States to intervene now do want the United States to intervene. There was a recent resolution in the UN General Assembly, and it was supported by Libya, by Tunisia, and by Egypt for the first time ever, talking about the outside world taking a stronger hand in what was going on in Syria.
Let me go across the table here to Don Abelson and also go across the floor to the Republican side of the equation. Mitt Romney. How do you think he is viewed in the Middle East at the moment?
Well, certainly in Israel, I think there are a lot of people who would view his candidacy as being fairly favorable. I mean, he gave a speech a few days ago at the Virginia Military Institute. He indicated unequivocally that the United States would never betray its most ardent ally in the Middle East, Israel. And I think he played on a narrative that has been circulating for some time, that the Obama administration over several months has distanced itself from Benjamin Netanyahu and from the Israeli government. So I think for many in Israel, particularly those that support Likud, I don't think they would flinch in having Mitt Romney. Now, the problem is, clearly he has to get up to speed on the complexities of the Middle East, but I think he would be seen as a staunch ally.
There's a difference between distancing himself from and betraying.
Yes.
Do you think Obama has betrayed Israel?
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. But again, that's one narrative that has been evolving for some time. I think Joe Biden, going back to the point that Paul made last night in the vice presidential debate,
Thursday night, we should say.
Sorry, Thursday night. Biden made it very, very clear that the relationship between Barack Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu couldn't be stronger. They both have a common foe, and that's in Iran and Iran's willingness to try and acquire nuclear capability. So no, I don't believe that Barack Obama has betrayed Israel, but there has been some friction, and that has been picked up on by a number of observers.
Let's go to Western Canada. Wenren Jiang, how much appetite do you see among the countries of the Middle East for the United States to get more deeply involved in Syria?
Well, there are some individual governments, as previous speaker mentioned, may want the United States to get a little bit closer to the Middle Eastern or even into their own countries. But these are the regimes now are supposed to be closer and friendlier to the United States. But overall, if you look at the past 4 years, the record of U.S. policy, President Obama or U.S. As a whole in the Middle East, structural fundamental issues, none of them have been resolved. The United States may have done a few things, winning a few battles, such as killing Osama bin Laden, but the overall war, if they call it a war against the terror or whatever in that region, or the war especially on the public opinion by the Arab world, the United States is not getting anywhere close to be recovering. In fact, the United States didn't really know how to respond to the Arab Spring, and the foreign policy area is messy at the moment on how to direct itself and get its image through. Another dimension nobody mentioned so far is that the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, intervention in Libya and in now Syria, opened up another front, confrontational, hostile in a sense, tense with both Russia and China. So these are the structural global issues that United States next president, Obama or Romney, they must be dealing with.
There's 150 cranes in the sky in this city right now. And Cheryl, let me bring you in at this point and talk about who it is that's going to be living in all of these places. Mm-hmm. What kind of an impact do you think the condo boom has had on who actually lives in the downtown of Ontario's capital city now?
Well, I think it's great for, those that are ages like sort of 25 to 35, right? They're, just graduating, getting started, right?
So it is overwhelmingly young people?
That's where the bulk of the demographic is going to come from. That's the fastest growing demographic as well, right? So you talk about the offspring of the baby boomers. So they're, when they're looking to buy something or to rent, because I think another issue that we're going to have to talk about is a lot of the units are actually going to be leased.
So somebody will own them and then rent them out to somebody else?
Exactly.
Okay.
And I think the numbers are now going to be as close to 50% of the units are probably going to be leased. So that provides a good opportunity for someone to get into the market or for their parents to buy it and for them to move in. And I think we're also going to see some empty nesters who are also going to see it as a great opportunity to, no longer deal with, having to care with their homes and things like that. So I think there's going to be an interesting, potentially some NIMBYism happening in terms of some conflicting interests about how condos get defined, and that's going to relate to issues of condo boards potentially and governance about...
Hold that thought, we're going to get to that. Is this an unambiguously good story? 25 to 35-year-olds moving into the downtown in such large numbers?
Simply, yes.
It is.
There are lots of complexities that are going to come. There's no question. I mean, it's an interesting point. One of the reasons that all these buildings are so tall is because nobody was objecting to them. But all of a sudden, when they start to fill up, and everybody's neighbors, it's like the buildings at Yonge and Eglinton that all the neighbors around objected to. Well, you'll start to get that kind of NIMBYism happening, which is actually a good thing because it's showing in a funny way that there's a real community maturing in those buildings. I don't think. Particularly the big dense packed clusters of condos have really settled down yet as to who's there and who's there permanently, who's there temporarily. I mean, oddly, the city doesn't really know. Nobody knows who's living in those buildings. Somebody needs to do a really good count and figure that out, a census. But
is it problematic if half the people are renters as opposed to owners? Is that problematic?
No, half the people in the city are renters. I mean, I think it's actually, in a strange way, it's a kind of privatization of the rental market. We're not getting any affordable rental housing built by anybody. No rental housing at all being built. So
is this stuff affordable?
The stuff that's being rented out is actually being rented out at market, and it's much more affordable probably than moving in to buy it. Yeah. So
I think one of the issues is you have a lot of offshore investments, as you might in a city like Vancouver, where there's sort of empty units in like 75% of a lot of the condos in Vancouver are really empty and vacant.
They're investments for
for people who do not live there. In Toronto, a huge number of people are pouring into the condos. Yes, many of them are young. I think a lot of them will be aging boomers who want to be able to live and shop and be downtown. To me, some of the other issues have to do with the sustainability of these towers, the cheapness of a lot of the construction. How well are they going to endure? Are they actually going to start falling apart in 15 to 20 years?
Let me ask you about that, because you see what's going downtown. We're 15 minutes north of downtown right here. You see what's going up at this corner. You got lots of new condominiums being built at the corner of Yonge and Eglinton. Do you see a significant difference between what's being built down there and what's being built up here?
There's sort of a formula for Toronto of condo design. It's largely to do with window wall construction, green glass, sometimes blue grass. Typically low iron glass is more expensive. Curtain wall construction, which flexes independently of a building, which has a greater lifespan, is more expensive, typically is saved for commercial building, not used for all of these 150 condo towers now on the boards. So there are issues around formula of design. It's sort of like we're building the generic suburb in the sky. And that, all of the accusations that we could level around the sameness, the formulaic design of the suburbs, now I think I could level towards a lot of the condos which we're now seeing in Toronto.
Are you seeing that too, Joe?
Yeah, I think there is a worry here. It's been a little bit pile them high, sell them cheap, although they're not selling them so cheap. And as Lisa says, there's such competition. There's so many of these buildings that they are built in a very formulaic way. I mean, that's why they go straight up, is because you just repeat the construction process all the way up. I think we actually have a very good buildings department, a very good inspection department here, but we are picking up some issues. There are windows, there are things falling off these buildings, and I think we're probably going to see that an increasing problem as we go down the years.
This notion of ghettoizing, very tall, vertical homes for people, is that something that concerns you?
Yeah, because I think we talk, as your panel earlier described, we talk a lot about the need for infrastructure, social infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but the city is really not very good at doing that. We don't add park space. Can you name a new school that was built in downtown Toronto recently? I mean, there have been a couple of renovations, but we have 100,000 new people living in the downtown, very few children. 20, 30 years from now, maybe we'll have more children, but we won't have any more schools. So we have this mismatch that exists, and I think that the city is very opportunistic in allowing a lot of these very, very high density buildings to go up, but then is not willing to kind of take the next step, which is investing in the infrastructure, because we have this dialogue with ourselves that we don't have money to invest in the city, and we're overtaxed, and we need to constantly cut services and cut taxes and not borrow so much, and so we let the second part of the equation sort of fall to the wayside.
Do you think anybody at the city level is on top of this?
I think the people in the planning department and some of the people on city council understand the dynamic, but I think that it's very difficult to break because we have this conversation. We've been having this conversation in Toronto for a century that we are overtaxed. We don't want to pay more for things, and so we always turn our back on investing in these important infrastructure elements to city building.
What do you think needs to be done to prevent that?
Well, I think that certainly we need more transit. We need, we need more schools and community centers and the type of things that make for a complete neighborhood, which are really missing in some of these buildings and in some of these neighborhoods. So there are these vertical neighborhoods. So you need to kind of fill out the picture. St. Jamestown is a really great example. It was built in the 1970s. It had one tiny little inadequate school. They had portables, tons of portables there. There was, no libraries. There's no community center. It took years and years of political fighting to retrofit that neighborhood, which has thousands of people living in it, with basic amenities that, that Torontonians who live in residential neighborhoods take for granted. And why is that?
Gotcha. John, thanks for coming in tonight.
Thanks,
Appreciate your time.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review, and you can see all of those programs in their entirety on our website, theagenda.tvo.org, on iTunes, and on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.